It's hard to believe, but 50 years ago today, Hollywood starlet Sharon Tate, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and three others were brutally murdered at 10050 Cielo Drive in the Hollywood Hills. And 50 years later, the property looks a lot different, but what remains is the legacy of these stories and these murders. On this edition of From the Constituency, I spoke with University of California law professor Hadar Avram, who studies the Manson murders and their impact on the nation's criminal justice system.
So my book is called Yesterday's Monsters, The Manson Family Cases and the Illusion of Parole. And it's a book that looks at the California parole process through the cases of these very interesting individuals, the 7 inmates of the Manson family that were sentenced to death in 1971. And then in 1972, all of their sentences were commuted to life with parole. And this all happens in the early 70s, and all of these people, except for 2, are still in prison. 2 of them passed away. Susan Atkins died in 2010. Charles Manson died in 2017. Everybody else is still in prison. 3 of them were already recommended for parole by the parole board, but the governor reversed. And it's looking fairly unlikely that any of them is going to come out. We're now talking about people in their late 60s, 70s. And looking at the parole hearings, you get a really interesting story of what it was like, what these 50 years in prison have been like, what the parole board's looking at, and most importantly, how the parole board can keep somebody in prison if they really don't want to let them out.
And I think one of the examples you gave was, I forget which of the women was terminally ill. And I guess it was a relative of the Sharon Tate who basically said she's a danger to society, don't let her out. What was that about again?
So Susan Atkins is one of the women who were followers of Charles Manson back in the 60s and participated in the murder of Sharon Tate. There's an interesting factual controversy there because Susan Atkins, at the time when she was still very much enthralled to Charles Manson, claimed that she had stabbed Sharon Tate herself. She later recanted that version and said that she didn't do the actual stabbing. Incidentally, a version that is supported by the person who she claims did the actual stabbing, Tex Watson, who now claims that he did the stabbing himself. Nonetheless, she had never been released from prison, and in the 2000s, she became very, very ill. At this point, she married a man, James Whitehouse, who was a Harvard-educated lawyer, and he represented her in the hearings. And when her 2009 hearing comes around, she already has a brain tumor that has her barely responsive. So she's essentially wheeled into the parole room on a gurney. She's lying down. She's non-responsive. She's basically sleeping most of the hearing. They're giving her, her ADA, warnings about, earphones, and he says, it doesn't really make a difference whether she can hear or not because she's basically asleep. The only thing she manages to say is to kind of just barely complete the syllables when her husband leads her through the Lord's Prayer. And Deborah Tate, Sharon Tate's sister, is in the room arguing that this woman who is not responsive is a danger to society. So Deborah Tate prevails. The parole board does not let her go and essentially agrees with this idea that she's still a danger to society. And this woman, who is at that point almost a vegetable, gets to spend the last few months of her life in prison rather than outside at her husband's side.
Why does the public see these murders as being in a class of their own? Because I think you've made the point that certainly there have been other mass murders, even in California,
right,
since the Tate LaBianca murders. And really, this series of events in 1969 just seems to captivate the public in maybe a not healthy way. I don't know how you would put it. But.
Absolutely. So the murders happened in the late 60s, and at the time, Joan Didion writes in her memoir, Slouching Toward Bethlehem, the world changed on that day in June of 1969. And the popular perception that people have written about the murders since then is Manson killed the 60s. This idea that the hippies were all about love and light, and this was all this, innocent revolution to free us from the constraints of convention. All of this takes a very dark turn with these murders, and they come to symbolize essentially the end of the 60s. It also happens at a very interesting moment in the California criminal justice policy time, because these people are sentenced to death in 1971. At the time, in fact, the death penalty is in decline. So not a lot of Americans support the death penalty. The 60s is pretty much the only time in the history of the United States where there's more people in the United States that oppose the death penalty than people that support it. So all of these people are sentenced to death, and I can tell you a little bit about why that is and what the prosecutor in those cases, Bugliosi, had to do with this. But and after the verdicts or the sentences come down in 1971, in 1972, the death penalty makes a temporary exit off of the American stage. So the Supreme Court decides a case called Furman versus Georgia, and they say there's all kinds of problems with the way the death penalty is applied. But more importantly, a few months before Furman, the California Supreme Court decides a case called People versus Anderson. And in People versus Anderson, the Supreme Court says the death penalty debases us as a society. It's not dignified. It's dehumanizing. We're just not going to do it anymore. And this just provokes an enormous amount of rage because it comes very, very shortly in the heels of the Manson verdicts. And people are really galvanized to do something about it. And that very year, there's already a voter initiative on the ballot saying the death penalty is constitutional. And subsequently, the Supreme Court brings the death penalty back in Greck versus Georgia in 1976. And California has a new death penalty on the books in 1978. But because these cases are so formative, it's important to say that 1978 is a really crucial year in the life of these cases. Because 1978 is the year in which all of these people come up for parole for the first time. Now, it's important to keep in mind that sentencing, even for serious crimes, has changed a lot since the early 70s. And at the time, if you were sentenced for, I can't say garden variety murder, but not a, heinous murder or whatever, it was perfectly conceivable that you would be out of prison in 10 or 15 years. Certainly the women in this case that were young women and would maybe elicit sympathy, it was not outlandish for people in the 70s to think, oh my God, these women could actually be out. This horrifying case, this could really turn. And because of that, when the death penalty comes back to California in 1978, it brings a friend with it. And California basically creates life without parole, with the idea that if for some reason there's a fluke and we can't give serious criminals the death penalty, at least we're going to have this option that guarantees that people are going to be in prison for the rest of their lives. And they ratchet up life with parole so that you're not going to come up after 7 years, you need to wait 25 years. So everything gets ratcheted up. And in Yesterday's Monsters, I refer to this as the trifecta of extreme punishment, right? Because now we have 3 extreme punishments, right? We have life without parole, we have life with parole, and we have the death penalty. And they all kind of look alike. They're all basically the same. Because California, since the death penalty comes back, only executes 13 people. Since then, we've had more of 100 people die of natural causes. So the death penalty is basically like life without parole. Life without parole is life without parole. And life with parole is also like life without parole because nobody's getting out. Now, the other reason people aren't getting out is that in 1988, California adopts another voter initiative saying that if the parole board decides to release people, that's not the end of the story. Because the governor can walk in and veto that decision. And of course, which case is quoted by the people putting this forward? The Manson family cases, which start every time there is another issue like this. Now, what happens is that now the governor holds political power. Nobody wants to look like they're the ones who let the Manson family go. Right? Nobody before Jerry Brown let anybody out. So Gray Davis and Arnold Schwarzenegger actually did not release anyone on parole. Jerry Brown does release people on parole, but does not release these people. And we've now seen Gavin Newsom, who's made all kinds of courageous decisions in his very brief gubernatorial history now. Moratorium on the death penalty, reforming criminal juvenile justice. Not enough to release Leslie Van Houten and Bobby Beausoleil, who have both been recommended for parole. So all of this trend of making things more extreme, of thinking about extreme crime, is driven by this imagination that these crimes are very unique, they're very special, and these people, no matter what happens or how laudable their lives become or how rehabilitated they are, they must never come out because we need them in prison.
Does it, in your estimation, a lot of it come down to Sharon Tate? I mean, an attractive, young, blonde, Hollywood movie star, captivating audiences, and the whole notion that she would be brutally murdered along with her soon-to-be-born son. And you think that's really what sort of sticks in it for most people as to why they just can't seem to get this out of their mind?
So to me, I think the victim piece of the story is extremely important. And I'm actually not surprised that the Tarantino movie that's about to hit the screens seems to focus on the Sharon Tate aspect of the story, because that is partly what's very captivating here. Incidentally, Sharon Tate is only one of 9 victims of this series of murders, but she's the one that people tend to remember. Now, when I was working on Yesterday's Monsters, one of the things that I looked at was this book. It's called Restless Souls. It's a memoir of the Tate family. And it walks you through sort of the role that they served in essentially launching the victims' rights movement in California. Now, when we think about crime victims in California, we typically think about people like the Tate family. We think about Mark Klass, the father of Polly Klass, and basically the case that, created the three strikes law, things like that. We don't think about the people that are much more frequently victims of violent crime, essentially poor people of color who become victims of gun violence. Instead, we think of this because the Manson murders essentially shape this idea that the quintessential victim, the most innocent, righteous victim, the person with the most right to ask for the most serious sentence, is a beautiful, famous, white woman about to give birth to a beautiful, famous, white child. And I mean, aside from it actually, does create, an extra layer of cruelty and heinousness to the murder. This woman is 9 months pregnant. She's begging for the life of her child. Of course, this is horrifying, and I don't want to make little of that. It has, though, been 50 years since then, and the family had continuously gone to all the hearings. And now, one of the things that I do in Yesterday's Monsters is I track the participation of victims throughout the 50 years of the hearings. And one of the things that I notice is that as the victims' rights movement gains a lot of power in California, largely due to the advocacy of the Tate family and other victims of the same demographic, right? The law increasingly allows more and more people to attend the hearings and speak on behalf of the victims. So now, especially after Marsy's law that comes into effect in 2008, you could come to the parole hearing. You could be a victim. You could be a family member of a victim. You could be a support member, a support for the family. You could be an advocate. You could be a support member for the advocate team. So when I look, for example, at a case like Tex Watson's, for example, it starts off with just one member of the Tate family attending the hearings, and it mushrooms to 17 people. And the commissioners let all the victims speak at the hearings. Sometimes it takes many, many hours. It can be grueling. Not all victims have the money, have the time, have the wherewithal to do it. So there's also differences between different parole hearings in terms of how invested the victim is in having their voice heard. And this narrative also doesn't leave any room for victims that are not on board with this punitive perspective to speak out. In fact, Tex Watson became a born-again Christian in prison. And amazingly, he became friends with a cousin of the LaBiancas, a woman by the name of Susan, who was also a born-again Christian. They hit it off based on their shared faith, and they became friends. And she actually comes to a hearing in 1990 to ask that he be released. And after she speaks at the hearings, the Tate family verbally attack her in the parking lot. They spit on her, they curse her, and of course she never shows up for another hearing. So in listening to this type of voice of the victims where there's no forgiveness, any moment that you're alive is a moment that my family member is dead, and therefore, you must never see the light of day. This kind of narrative becomes the formative narrative of the California victims movement, even though there are many, many crime victims who don't necessarily feel this way.
How much does this helter-skelter narrative that I guess the prosecutor came up with, and that got a lot of attention, and still does? You think Manson, you think helter-skelter. Right. How much of that plays a role in this, and how much of that is overblown in your estimation?
So the main story about the murders that most people are familiar with is the story in this book called Helter Skelter, written by Vincent Bugliosi, who was the original LA DA in charge of the case. And Bugliosi writes Helter Skelter shortly after the convictions. There's, later editions with stories about what happened in prison. But in the book, he essentially lays out his version of the murders. And his version comes at a very dramatic junction in his investigation of the case, where he sits down with two young disciples of Manson, and they basically tell him this. And the story is this. What we all know, of course, is that Manson had had a horrible childhood. He spent, many, many years in juvenile facilities of various kinds, spent a lot of stretches in federal prison. So he was already a fairly hardened criminal toward the late 60s when he shows up in the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco in 1967. Right? The summer of love is over. Drugs and violence and lost kids essentially are all over the Haight-Ashbury. And he starts gathering followers. They buy a bus, they take out the seats, they travel up and down the coast of California, and they eventually settle in LA, where he's trying to launch his musical career. And they start engaging in all kinds of petty crime. They're loosely associated with motorcycle clubs that are very active at the time in the California countercultural scene. And here is where versions differ, right? The story that Helter Skelter tells you is that at some point, Manson starts preaching to the people in the cult that there's going to be an Armageddon war between the blacks and the whites. Now, if this seems completely far-fetched to you, it's because we're in 2019. But in 1968, when there were race riots, basically setting all of Southern California ablaze with violence, this was not as far-fetched and outlandish as it sounds now. Right? So there's going to be this end of the world war between the blacks and the whites. The blacks are going to win, but after they win, they're going to realize that they're actually unable to govern themselves, and then the Manson family will come out of hiding and will govern them. Now, this story essentially paints the murders as very outlandish because there's this bizarre ideology. In interviews that Bugliosi had given since then, he said, what makes these cases unique is how bizarre they are. But in fact, he actually needed this story as a convincing legal theory, and here's why. At the time, California law made it very difficult to prosecute someone for first-degree murder unless that person was personally involved in the murder. Charlie Manson himself, even though he was puppeteering everybody else, was not present at the scene of the crime. So Bugliosi would have to have a very strong motive that ties Manson to the crime and also doesn't make mindless robots of the followers. And that's why this story was crucially important for him to guarantee his legal success in convicting everybody involved for first-degree murder. Now, this is not to say that this story is not true. But as is the case with truth, a truth often will obscure other truths. And at the same time, there are other stories that you can tell about this murder that are also true and that came to the forefront of the conversation only years after these people were convicted. So one of the stories is a story about cults, right? So essentially, Manson is a very charismatic leader. He has a lot of influence. He's also, as we learn in later years, was terrifyingly violent and abusive toward the girls, especially the girls. Everybody else, but especially the girls, are not sleeping. They're hopped out of their mind on drugs. The girls are being, regularly sexually trafficked to all kinds of people, like the Beach Boys that Manson was trying to, curry favor with to advance his musical career. So in essence, what we're talking about is a cult and brainwashed people. But this idea of a cult and brainwashing was not part of the American conversation in the late 60s. When people thought about brainwashing at the time, they thought about things like the Manchurian Candidate, right? People coming back from the Korean War and being brainwashed. The whole notion of cult only comes into the domestic conversation in the mid-70s, and unsurprisingly, it's because of something from Korea. It's because of the Moonies. Because parents of adults that had been sucked into the cult of the Moonies, Reverend Moon, are saying, I've lost my kid, what do I do? And then the California Senate holds this very cautious hearing, the California legislature, about kind of like what's really going on here. And they hear evidence from members of cults, former members of cults, family members, and from a guy by the name of Ted Patrick, who is the granddaddy of deprogramming. These are the folks that were, snatching people off the street, taking them to hotel rooms and, trying to, bring some critical thinking back, right? So this guy's the pioneer of this profession of deprogramming. And at the hearings, he actually says, we're talking 1973, had the Manson cases come today in 1973, we would likely see the women as victims, not as perpetrators. So here's a book by a woman by the name of Carleen Faith, who was a criminology professor at Simon Fraser University in Canada. At the time, she was a graduate student at University of Santa Cruz, and the warden, she was doing some work at a women's prison. The warden said, hey, I have these girls here. They've just gotten off of death row, but they're still in isolation. We don't know what to do with them. Can you tutor them? And she actually spent several years getting to know all three of the girls, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten. She becomes quite friendly with Leslie Van Houten for a long while. They exchange letters. And she writes this, very feminist, critical book about, how these women were essentially exploited and now we're not letting them out. So this is the second narrative. And then there's the third story, which again is also true, but was kind of obscured because of the Helter Skelter story. And this is a story that the inmates themselves tell in some of the books that they wrote behind bars. So Susan Atkins wrote a couple of books, and Tex Watson wrote a couple of books, and they're saying there's nothing outlandish or bizarre about these murders. This is essentially a drug deal gone bad. And this story is supported by a biography of Manson that journalist Jeff Gwynne publishes in 2012. And the story is this. Probably at the behest of Manson, Tex Watson sells bad drugs to a motorcycle club. The motorcycle club threatens the Manson family unless they pay them back for the bad drugs. They don't have any money, so they go to a loose associate of the family, a music teacher by the name of Gary Hinman. They terrify this guy. They try to get him to sign his car away to them. He doesn't comply, and Bobby Beausoleil ends up killing him. Bobby Beausoleil gets apprehended for this crime very, very quickly. They're onto him. They put him in prison. They've solved the crime. And the Manson family, essentially out of love and loyalty and wanting to help their comrade in prison, are saying, okay, what if we were to commit murders that look like the Hinman murder? So the Manson family wants to help Bobby Beausoleil, right? And then they say, okay, we're going to commit some murders. We're going to craft the murder scene to look like the murder scene from the Hinman case so that the police connect the dots and they're going to realize that they have the wrong person behind bars. Of course, they way overestimate the ability of the LA Police Department to connect the dots because it's two different agencies working on the murder. Nobody actually ever draws the connection between the crimes. But essentially, that is another way to tell the story of these crimes that make them, it's not, of course, less horrible. The violence, the violence is still awful. The victims don't suffer any less, but it makes the murder lose some of its kind of, mystical veneer, and it makes it look a lot more like an ordinary killing. Now, I should also say, between the 60s and the 80s, in general, there were many serial killings happening in California. Serial killers were very active in California during those years. A lot of this is the fallout from the 60s, people being released from, Reagan was governor, closing the mental health hospital, releasing people without any treatment options. There's a lot of drugs going about. So there's a lot of sinister stuff going on in California between the 60s and 80s. And there actually are horrific serial murders happening in California in these years. There's just thinking about Lake and Ing, killing 40,000 people, 40-something people and burying them in Watsonville near their cabin after torturing them. There's unthinkable crimes happening in California at a time. But this is the one that becomes etched in the memory because the helter-skelter narrative makes it seem as if this is a thing that's in a category of its own.
And so the book goes through all of this.
So the book goes through all of this, and it also tells the story of what happened to these people afterwards when they were in prison. I made a point in the book of not including, crime scene photos from the trial, things like that. When there is art in the book, it portrays people the way they look now. They're elderly people in prison clothes coming to their parole hearing. And what you see is that people, when they're in their late 60s, they're not the same person that they were when they were 19. We're talking about people with families, people with advanced degrees, people who have changed their religions, people who do a lot of rehabilitation in prison and who look back and really repudiate their history as teenagers. I should also mention we've since changed our opinion in general about childhood. We now think about teenagers and adolescents in a very different way than we used to at the time. So we used to we sort of forgot about childhood for a while between the 60s and the 90s. In the 2000s, we're sort of rediscovering the fact that the brain continues to grow well into your mid-20s, and you might make horrific decisions as a teenager or an adolescent that you later come to regret. And we need to take that into account in terms of punishment.
So what was the main reason then for the book? Was it dealing with how to tell these kinds of stories? Was it the neglect of the childhood aspect in all of this, or what?
So the idea for the book came out of all the criminal justice reforms that we started seeing toward the late 2000s. So in 2015, I wrote this book, which is called Cheap on Crime. And in Cheap on Crime, I talk about how the Great Recession of 2008 changed the way that we think about punishment. That all of a sudden we're sort of scaling back this, monster apparatus of prison because it's expensive, essentially, not because we became better people, but because we can't actually afford to incarcerate so many people. And that logic sort of continues through the years. But for the most part, the reforms that I talked about in Cheap on Crime were applied to nonviolent offenders. So what you typically see is, let's legalize marijuana, let's come up with treatment in the community for nonviolent offenders so that we can afford to incarcerate the people that really deserve to be in prison, the real criminals. So you're seeing this new appraisal of nonviolent offenders at the same time that there's this retrenchment about how we think about violent crime. And that made me think, well, then how do we treat violent offenders? Like, has our idea of how to treat a violent offender changed? And the people I thought of is the quintessential violent offenders, right? The people that are most reviled in the state of California and have been the most reviled for 50 years. And I decided to see what happened to them. So I contacted the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, and I said, can I have all the parole hearings that these people have ever had since the time that they went into prison? And much to my delight and my surprise, they said sure, and they sent me the whole thing. It's all public information. It should be accessible to the public. Anyone can look at these things. But because nobody does, nobody knows what actually happens in parole hearings. And these cases gave me an opportunity to use a high-profile case that people are familiar with to give people a window into a world that they're not familiar with. What do these hearings look like? How does the parole board make sense of people's history? How do people explain their story or kind of perform their story to show that they've been changed? It's also the idea that kind of I once was blind, but now I see. Like now, after all these years that I've spent in prison, I have this new perspective on why I committed the crime. And people are supposed to tell their narrative in a very choreographed fashion. Typically, what the lawyers do is essentially the lawyers don't actually talk almost at all at the hearing itself. They're just coaching you about how to tell your story in a way that the parole board's going to be convinced that you're not the same person that you were when you committed the crime. And I look at how this story is, how the parole board understands the story. How does the parole board make sense of your disciplinary hearings? It's almost impossible to spend this amount of time in prison without having a disciplinary write-up, for example. And the people in my sample actually have remarkably clean records, right? And I can see that they're still picking up on, well, you had a quarter in your pocket, 8 years ago. Or what's about this thing where you had a knife in your hand and it turns out it wasn't a knife, it turns out it was a spoon. So kind of like how every little incident becomes magnified and becomes this kind of like lens to tell us, no, you are still a monster and we can't let you go. What happens with rehabilitation programs, right? One of the things that happened over the years in California prisons is that gradually funding for rehabilitation programs started getting cut. And one of the things that I found is that parole boards were regularly requiring that people attend rehabilitation programs that don't exist. Or that people were being dinged for not attending rehabilitation programs that they could not attend because they were in solitary and they were not allowed to leave their cell. And nonetheless, the parole board says, well, you didn't attend the program, so it's not my fault. I'm in solitary. I can't get out. Or what does the parole board do with old age and illness? One of the things that we know from life course criminology is that for the most part, in terms of violent crime, people age out of it. Late 20s, early 30s, people are already out of it. They're not going to commit violent crime anymore. So what is the motivation behind keeping people behind bars, and how do we explain to ourselves that this person is still a risk? Now, note, I'm not saying that these people are not a risk. Maybe, reasonable minds can differ. And actually, I leave that question open in the book for the readers to decide on their own. I think somebody could make the argument that Manson, who was very manipulative and still has fans out there, was still a fairly dangerous man well into his 80s. But does this apply across the board to everybody who's in their 60s? So a lot of these questions sort of float around on how this group of people who have no special training, they're essentially former chiefs of police, former prison guards, former sheriffs. That's what qualifies you to get politically appointed to be on the committee. In recent years, they get a little bit of training, but that was not the case until like 4 or 5 years ago. And the question is, how do they decide whether somebody's changed? And I think these cases, partly because we have 50 years worth of records, are a good opportunity for us to look at this and say, this is a lot of unfettered discretion to give to untrained people and to the political operative that can veto the decision to release.
It's fascinating stuff, Adar. We really appreciate it. This has been great. And the book, Yesterday's Monsters?
The book's name is Yesterday's Monsters, The Manson Family Cases and the Illusion of Parole, and it comes out early February 2020.
Oh, I can't wait.
So just a few short months.
Great stuff. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate it.